The summer of 2019 was supposed to be like any other in Mercer County, Missouri. The corn was knee-high by the 4th of July, the soybeans were thick and green, and the wheat harvest had come in strong. But out on Route 7, past the grain elevator and the abandoned Sinclair station, there was a 40-acre plot that nobody wanted to talk about anymore. Not the way they used to. That land belonged to Clara Whitfield, or rather, it had belonged to her grandfather, Emmett Whitfield, who bought it in 1962 with money he'd saved, working double shifts at the Ford plant in Kansas City. Emmett was a man who understood things about the land that the agricultural extension agents couldn't put in their pamphlets. He knew where the water wanted to go. He knew which slopes held the morning cool and which ones baked by 10 in the morning. He knew that a farm without water was just a theory waiting to fail. So, in the spring of 1974, Emmett did something that made him the subject of every coffee shop conversation for 20 miles. He dug a pond. Not just any pond. He chose a low spot in the northeast corner of his property, where the groundwater came up close enough to smell like iron and possibility. He didn't hire a contractor with a backhoe. He did it himself, with a shovel and a wheelbarrow and a stubbornness that his granddaughter would inherit in full measure. It took him 3 summers. 3 summers of digging in the clay-heavy soil, of hauling rocks the size of washing machines, of shaping the edges so the cattle could drink without slipping. When he was done, the pond was roughly 2 acres, fed by a spring that never seemed to run dry, surrounded by willows and cottonwoods that he'd transplanted from the river bottom. The water was so clear in the mornings that you could see the bluegill beds along the shallows, and so dark by evening that it looked like a piece of the sky had fallen into the earth. The other farmers thought he was crazy. Land that could be growing corn or soybeans, and he'd turned it into a glorified swimming hole. They called it Emmett's Folly. They said he was wasting good dirt on a vanity project. They said the water would breed mosquitoes, and the willows would suck the moisture from the surrounding fields. They said a lot of things, but Emmett just smiled and went back to tending his pond. What they didn't understand, what they couldn't understand, was that Emmett wasn't building a pond. He was building a reservoir. He was building a cooling system. He was building insurance against a future that he could feel coming in his bones, even if he couldn't name it. The pond changed everything about that 40 acres. The microclimate shifted. The humidity around the water kept the soil cooler during the hottest parts of the day. The willows broke the wind that otherwise would have stripped moisture from the leaves of his crops. The frogs and dragonflies that came to the pond ate the insects that plagued his neighbors' fields. And when the rain came hard, the pond absorbed the runoff that would have washed topsoil into the creek, saving not just Emmett's land, but the land downstream. Emmett died in the winter of 2008, sitting in his rocking chair on the porch, looking out at his pond. He was 86 years old. Clara was 12. And she'd spent every summer of her life on that farm, learning the things her grandfather had to teach. She knew how to read the color of the water, to tell if the spring was running strong. She knew which birds nested in which willows. She knew that the pond was the heart of the farm, and that without it, everything else was just waiting to die. Clara's father, Emmett's son, had no interest in farming. He was an accountant in Columbia, and he saw the land as an asset to be managed, not a living thing to be tended. After Emmett's death, he leased the farm to a corporate operation out of Des Moines that planted GMO corn and soybeans in strict rotation, sprayed everything with Roundup, and treated the pond like an inconvenience. They let the willows die. They stopped maintaining the spillway. They told Clara's father that the pond was taking up valuable acreage, and he believed them. Clara went to college at the University of Missouri, studying environmental science with a focus on hydrology. She learned the technical language for everything her grandfather had known by instinct. She learned about aquifer recharge and evapotranspiration and thermal mass. She learned that what Emmett had built wasn't just a pond. It was a constructed wetland. It was a heat sink. It was a biodiversity corridor in a landscape that was becoming increasingly hostile to anything that wasn't corn. She came home every summer. And every summer she saw the farm dying a little more. The pond, neglected, had become a stagnant algae bloom. The fields, planted in monoculture, were losing their topsoil to every hard rain. The groundwater, pumped relentlessly for irrigation, was dropping by feet every year. She tried to talk to her father about it, but he was too busy with his spreadsheets to listen. In 2017, Clara's father had a heart attack. He survived, but the experience shook him. He decided to sell the farm, not to another farmer, to a developer who wanted to build a subdivision of McMansions for people who worked in Kansas City, but wanted to pretend they lived in the country. The developer's name was Richard Holloway, and he had a vision. He was going to call it Whitfield Estates, and every house was going to have a 3-car garage and a half-acre lot. Clara was 21 years old, and she had just finished her junior year. She came home to find surveyors walking the property, marking boundaries with pink flags. She found her father in the kitchen, signing papers. She asked him what he was doing. He told her he was being practical. He told her the farm was worth more as real estate than as agriculture. He told her that times had changed, and that sentimentality didn't pay the bills. Clara looked out the window at the pond. The willows were dead, but the water was still there, dark and patient. She thought about her grandfather digging in the clay with his shovel, building something that he would never see fully realized. She thought about the bluegill and the frogs and the herons that still came even though the pond was dying. She thought about the heat that was coming, the heat that everyone was talking about but nobody was preparing for. She made her father an offer. She would take over the farm. She would make the payments. She would find a way to make it work. He laughed at her. He told her she was a child. He told her that farming was a dying profession and that she was throwing her life away on a fantasy. But Clara had inherited her grandfather's stubbornness, and she had something else too. She had the knowledge that her grandfather hadn't had. She had the science to back up his intuition. She spent the summer of 2017 working on the pond. She cleared the dead willows and planted new ones. She rebuilt the spillway. She aerated the water. She introduced native aquatic plants that would filter the algae and provide habitat for the wildlife. She worked from dawn until dark, and when she went back to Columbia in the fall, she drove out every weekend to continue the work. Her father sold the farm anyway, not to the developer, because Clara had found a lawyer who discovered that the pond was classified as a wetland under state law, which made development difficult and expensive. But he sold the farming rights to a corporation that wanted to plant corn. They agreed to leave the pond alone, but they weren't happy about it. They called it a waste of space. They called it a liability. They called Clara a foolish girl who didn't understand modern agriculture. Clara graduated in 2019 with a degree in environmental science and a minor in agricultural economics. She moved back to the farm full-time. She had a plan. She was going to restore the pond to its full glory, and she was going to prove that it wasn't a waste of space. She was going to prove that it was the most valuable piece of the farm. She started by planting a buffer zone around the pond, native grasses and wildflowers that would filter runoff and provide habitat for pollinators. She installed a solar-powered pump that would circulate water from the deepest part of the pond to the shallows, keeping the water oxygenated and preventing the algae blooms that had plagued the neglected years. She built nesting boxes for wood ducks and platforms for ospreys. She turned the 2 acres of water into a thriving ecosystem that supported not just wildlife, but the entire farm. The corporation that owned the farming rights wasn't interested in Clara's experiments. They planted their corn right up to the edge of the buffer zone, and they sprayed their herbicides on windy days that carried the chemicals into Clara's wildflowers. They laughed at her when she complained. They told her that if she wanted to play at being a farmer, she should learn to accept the realities of modern agriculture. They told her that her pond was a quaint relic of a bygone era and that the future was in efficiency and yield. Clara didn't argue with them. She just kept working. She kept planting. She kept watching the water. The summer of 2019 started normally enough. The corn came up strong and the soybeans were thick and green. But by late June, something was wrong. The temperatures weren't just high. They were record-breaking. Day after day of temperatures over 100 degrees, with humidity that made the air feel like a wet blanket. The corn started to curl. The soybeans dropped their flowers. The corporate farmers turned on their irrigation systems, pumping water from the aquifer at rates that would have made Emmett Whitfield weep. Clara watched her neighbors' fields with a mixture of sadness and something else, something that felt like vindication, though she hated herself for feeling it. Because while their corn was curling and their soybeans were dying, her pond was doing exactly what her grandfather had built it to do. The water in the pond was warm, but it wasn't hot. The evaporation from the surface created a microclimate that kept the surrounding air 10 degrees cooler than the fields just 100 yards away. The willows, newly established and growing fast, provided shade that reduced the thermal stress on the plants in Clara's buffer zone. The native grasses, with their deep root systems, found moisture where the shallow-rooted corn found only dust. But it was the aquifer that told the real story. The pond, fed by its spring, was recharging the groundwater. While the corporate farmers were pumping the aquifer dry, Clara's pond was putting water back in. Not enough to save the whole county, but enough to save her 40 acres. Enough to keep her grandfather's legacy alive. By mid-July, the corporate farmers were in crisis mode. Their irrigation systems were running 24 hours a day, and the water table was dropping so fast that some of their wells were starting to suck air. The corn was stunted, the kernels half-formed. The soybeans were dropping leaves. The heat wasn't just damaging their crops, it was destroying them. And then, in the last week of July, the heat wave reached its peak. Temperatures hit 108 degrees, with a heat index of 120. The National Weather Service issued warnings that hadn't been seen in Missouri in a generation. The power grid strained under the load of air conditioners and irrigation pumps, and in the fields of Mercer County, the corn started to die. Not just the corn, the soybeans too. The wheat that had looked so promising in June was now a field of straw. The corporate farmers, the ones who had laughed at Clara's pond, watched their livelihoods turn to dust in the space of a week. They called the insurance companies. They called the USDA. They called everyone they could think of. But there was nothing anyone could do. The heat had won except on Clara's farm. Her pond, that waste of space, that liability, that foolish girl's vanity project, was the only thing standing between her and the same fate. The water in the pond was down, but it was still there. The spring, fed by aquifers that the pond had helped recharge, was still flowing. The microclimate, maintained by 2 acres of water and a stand of willows, was still 10 degrees cooler than the surrounding fields. Clara had planted her buffer zone with crops that could handle the heat. Sorghum, which uses water more efficiently than corn. Cowpeas, which fix nitrogen in the soil and tolerate drought. Sunflowers, which track the sun but don't wilt in its heat. She had interplanted fruit trees that would eventually provide shade and income. She had built a system that was resilient, that was diverse, that was prepared for exactly the kind of disaster that was unfolding around her. The corporate farmers came to see her farm. They came in their pickup trucks, with their hats in their hands, and they looked at her pond with new eyes. They looked at the green buffer zone, at the healthy crops, at the water that was still flowing when their own wells had run dry. They didn't laugh anymore. They didn't call her foolish. They asked her how she had done it. Clara told them about her grandfather. She told them about the 3 summers he had spent digging in the clay, building something that he would never see fully realized. She told them about the science she had learned in college, the hydrology and the ecology and the agricultural economics. She told them that the pond wasn't just water, it was thermal mass. It was a cooling system. It was insurance against a future that Emmett Whitfield had felt coming in his bones, even if he couldn't name it. She told them that the future of farming wasn't in efficiency and yield. It was in resilience and diversity. It was in understanding the land well enough to work with it instead of against it. It was in building systems that could survive the disasters that were coming, because they were coming. The heat wave of 2019 wasn't a fluke. It was a preview. Some of the farmers listened. Some of them started digging their own ponds, or restoring the ones their grandfathers had built and their fathers had neglected. Some of them started planting buffer zones and diversifying their crops. Some of them started looking at their land the way Emmett Whitfield had looked at his, as a living thing to be tended, not a factory to be optimized. Others didn't. They took the insurance money and planted the same corn the next year, in the same way, with the same expectation that the aquifer would never run dry and the heat would never come again. They were the ones who suffered the most when the drought of 2021 hit, and the heat wave of 2023, and the flash floods of 2024. Each disaster took more of them out of farming, until the only ones left were the ones who had learned to adapt. Clara Whitfield is still farming her 40 acres in Mercer County. Her pond is 5 acres now, expanded with the help of a grant from the Natural Resources Conservation Service. The willows are tall and thick, and the bluegill are so plentiful that she sells them to a restaurant in Kansas City. The fruit trees are bearing, and the sorghum and cowpeas have been joined by dozens of other crops in a rotation that keeps the soil healthy and the farm profitable. She gives tours to agricultural students from MU and Iowa State. She speaks at conferences about water management and climate resilience. She has been interviewed by the New York Times and National Geographic. But her favorite visitors are the old farmers, the ones who remember when every farm had a pond, when every farmer understood that water was life. They come to her farm and they stand by the pond, and they tell her stories about their own grandfathers, about the ponds they used to swim in as children, about the willows they used to climb, about the world that existed before efficiency became the only metric that mattered. And Clara listens, because she knows that she is not the one who saved this farm. She is just the one who remembered what her grandfather knew. The pond is still there, dark and patient, reflecting the sky. In the morning, the mist rises off the water and drifts across the fields, and the temperature drops just enough to let the crops breathe. In the evening, the frogs start their chorus, and the herons come to fish, and the world feels the way it is supposed to feel. Not efficient, not optimized, alive. Emmett Whitfield's Folly, that's what they called it back in 1974, when a man with a shovel and a dream started digging in the clay. They laughed at him then, the way they laughed at his granddaughter 45 years later. But the pond doesn't care about laughter. The pond just keeps doing what it was built to do. It keeps the land cool. It keeps the water flowing. It keeps the future possible. And on the hottest days of summer, when the temperature hits 105 and the corn is curling in the fields all around, Clara Whitfield walks down to the edge of her pond and dips her hand in the water. It is cool, impossibly cool, and it feels like her grandfather's hand on her shoulder, guiding her, telling her that she did the right thing, that she remembered, that she kept the faith. The heat will come again. The droughts will come again. The floods will come again. That is the nature of the world now. But on 40 acres in Mercer County, Missouri, there is a pond that was built by a stubborn old man who understood something that the experts had forgotten. There is a farm that survived the heat wave of 2019 because a young woman refused to let her grandfather's legacy be bulldozed. They called it wasteful. They called it foolish. They called it a liability. Until the heat came, and then they understood the pond was never the waste. The pond was the wisdom, and the crops that died in the fields around it, the crops that had been planted in the name of efficiency and yield, the crops that had been irrigated with water, pumped from an aquifer that was running dry, those were the real waste. Those were the real foolishness. Those were the liabilities that no insurance policy could cover. Clara Whitfield stands on the edge of her pond, watching the herons fish in the shallows, and she knows that her grandfather is still here. Not in a ghostly way, not in any way that science can measure, but in the water and the willows and the cool breeze that rises off the surface on a 100-degree day. In the knowledge that some things are worth building, even if you never see them finished. In the faith that the land will provide, if you provide for the land first. The sun is setting now, and the water is turning gold, and the frogs are starting their evening song. Tomorrow will be another hot day, and the day after that, and the day after that. But the pond will be here, and the farm will be here, and the wisdom of Emmett Whitfield will be here, passed down through his granddaughter to anyone who is willing to listen. They laughed when she refused to let them bulldoze her grandfather's pond. They called her a foolish girl who didn't understand modern agriculture. They told her that the future was in efficiency and yield, in bigger tractors and deeper wells and more chemicals. But the future, it turns out, was in the water. It was in the willows. It was in the stubborn refusal to let the old wisdom die. And when the heat came, when the crops withered and the wells ran dry, and the corporate farmers stood in their fields and watched their livelihoods turn to dust, Clara Whitfield walked down to her pond and dipped her hand in the cool, dark water. And she smiled because she knew. She had known all along. The pond wasn't wasteful. The pond was everything. And the people who had called it a liability, who had mocked her grandfather and laughed at her dreams, they finally understood too. Not because anyone told them, not because they read it in a book or heard it in a lecture, but because they stood in 108 degrees of Missouri heat, surrounded by dead corn and dying soybeans, and they felt the cool breeze rising off 2 acres of water that a stubborn old man had dug with a shovel and a stubborn young woman had refused to let die. They felt it, and they knew. Some wisdom cannot be taught. It can only be remembered. And some ponds cannot be measured in acres or dollars. They can only be measured in survival. Clara Whitfield's pond, Emmett Whitfield's legacy, the water that refused to be wasted, and the heat wave that finally made people understand why. The morning after the worst of the heat, Clara walked the perimeter of her property at dawn. The air was still thick with the memory of yesterday's furnace. But here, near the pond, it was different. The willows moved in a breeze that shouldn't have existed. A breeze born of evaporation and thermal exchange. A breeze that carried the scent of water and life instead of dust and death. She knelt at the edge of the buffer zone and pushed her fingers into the soil. It was moist, dark, alive. 300 yards away in the corporate fields, the soil was cracked and pale, the color of old bones. She thought about the science of it, the way she had explained it to her professors at MU. Water has a high specific heat capacity, which means it can absorb enormous amounts of thermal energy without changing temperature dramatically. A 2-acre pond, 6 feet deep in the center, holds roughly 4 million gallons of water. During a heat wave, that water absorbs heat from the surrounding air through evaporation, cooling the immediate environment by as much as 15 degrees Fahrenheit. The willows, with their extensive root systems, draw water from the saturated soil near the pond and release it through transpiration, adding to the cooling effect. The native grasses, with roots that reach 4 feet deep, access moisture that shallow-rooted corn never touches. The pollinators that Clara's wildflowers attract ensure that her crops set fruit even when the corporate corn's tassels have dried to dust. It wasn't magic. It was physics and biology and hydrology and ecology all working together in a system that Emmett Whitfield had built with his hands and his heart, not knowing the science, but knowing the truth of it in his bones. The corporate farm manager, a man named Doug Harrison, who had laughed the loudest at Clara's pond, came to see her on the 3rd day of the heat wave's peak. He drove his pickup slowly up her gravel drive, and when he got out, Clara could see that his face was sunburned, and his eyes were red with exhaustion and something that looked like grief. He had spent the previous night walking his fields with a flashlight, checking wells that were producing less and less water, watching the corn that he had planted in March turn to paper in the space of a single July. He stood at the edge of Clara's buffer zone and looked at her sorghum, which was still green and upright, still pushing toward the sun with a resilience that his corn had lost days ago. He looked at the wildflowers, which were blooming in defiance of the heat, their colors bright against the brown landscape. He looked at the pond, where a great blue heron was stalking the shallows, and at the willows, which were moving in that impossible breeze, and he didn't say anything for a long time. Clara didn't say anything either. She just stood beside him, and they watched a dragonfly hover over the water, its wings catching the morning light, and she knew that Doug Harrison was seeing something that he had never seen before. He was seeing a farm that was alive, not in spite of the heat, but because of the water. "Your grandfather," Doug said finally, his voice rough. "He knew, didn't he?" Clara nodded. "He knew. How? I don't think he could have told you how. He just felt it. He felt that the land needed water, that water was the heart of everything, and he spent 3 summers digging in the clay because he believed that heart needed to beat." Doug was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I spent 20 years thinking that bigger tractors and deeper wells and more chemicals were the answer. I spent 20 years looking at yield per acre and profit margins and thinking that was all that mattered. And now I'm standing here, watching my corn die, and I'm looking at your sorghum, and I'm wondering what else I got wrong." "You didn't get it wrong," Clara said. "You were doing what you were taught. We all were. The system told us that efficiency was the goal, that yield was the measure, that nature was something to be overcome. My grandfather didn't believe that. He believed that nature was something to work with, to understand, to respect. And I think the heat is teaching us that he was right." Doug stayed for an hour that morning. He walked the buffer zone with Clara, and she showed him the native grasses and explained how their deep roots accessed water that corn roots never reached. She showed him the solar pump that circulated water and kept the pond oxygenated. She showed him the nesting boxes and the platforms and the way the ecosystem worked together, each piece supporting the others, creating a resilience that no single crop could match. When he left, he shook her hand and said, "I'm going to dig a pond." I don't know how and I don't know when, but I'm going to dig a pond. And I'm going to plant some of those wildflowers. And I'm going to stop spraying so close to the water." Clara watched him drive away, his pickup kicking up dust on the gravel road, and she felt something shift in her chest. Not vindication, though there was some of that. Not pride, though there was some of that too. It was something quieter, something deeper. It was the feeling of a door opening, of a bridge being built, of a legacy being passed, not just from grandfather to granddaughter, but from one farmer to another, from one generation to the next. The heat wave broke on the 1st of August with a thunderstorm that rolled across Mercer County like a freight train, dropping 2 inches of rain in an hour. In the corporate fields, the rain ran off the compacted soil and into the creeks, carrying topsoil and fertilizer with it, turning the water brown and thick. On Clara's farm, the rain soaked into the buffer zone, filtered by the native grasses, absorbed by the deep roots, stored in the soil for the dry days that would come again. The pond rose 6 inches, fed by the runoff that the buffer zone couldn't absorb, the spillway doing its job. The water clear and clean where the corporate creeks were choked with mud. Clara stood on her porch and watched the storm, and she thought about her grandfather, who had built this system with nothing but a shovel and a belief that water was the answer. By September, the corporate farmers had filed their insurance claims and were debating whether to plant winter wheat or let the fields lie fallow. Their corn was a total loss, and their soybeans weren't much better. The heat wave had cost Mercer County millions of dollars in lost crops, and the federal government had declared the county a disaster area, which meant low-interest loans and emergency aid, but it didn't mean the crops would grow back. Clara's sorghum was ready for harvest, the heads heavy with grain that had formed in the relative cool of the pond's microclimate. Her cowpeas were drying on the vine, the pods full of protein-rich seeds that she would sell to a local food cooperative. Her sunflowers were bowing their heads, the seeds plump and oil-rich, ready for the press. She had lost some yield to the heat, but she hadn't lost the crop, and she hadn't lost the soil, and she hadn't lost the water. The University of Missouri sent a team of researchers to study her farm. They set up weather stations and soil moisture sensors and evaporation pans. They measured the temperature difference between her buffer zone and the corporate fields. They tested the water quality in her pond and the runoff in the creek. They wrote papers and gave presentations and cited Clara's farm as a model of climate-resilient agriculture. But Clara didn't need the researchers to tell her what she already knew. She knew it every morning when she walked to the pond and dipped her hand in the water. She knew it every evening when the frogs started their chorus and the herons came to fish. She knew it in the cool breeze that rose off the water on the hottest days, and in the mist that drifted across her fields at dawn, and in the green of her crops. When everything around her was brown, she knew it because her grandfather had known it, and because she had remembered, and because the heat wave had proved what they had both believed in their bones. Water is life, not just for drinking, not just for irrigation, but for cooling, for buffering, for creating the microclimates that allow life to persist when the world turns hostile. A pond is not a waste of space. It is the heart of the farm, the reservoir of resilience, the insurance policy that pays out not in dollars but in survival, and the people who laughed, who called it folly, who said it was a liability. They learned the lesson the hard way. In the 108 degrees of a Missouri heat wave, surrounded by dead corn and dry wells, and the dust of a future they had not prepared for. The following spring, Doug Harrison showed up at Clara's farm with a backhoe and a checkbook. He had sold 2 of his 4 tractors and used the money to buy the equipment he needed to dig his own pond. He had read every paper the MU researchers had published about Clara's farm. He had attended 3 of her conferences. He had talked to his banker, his insurance agent, and his wife, and they had all thought he was crazy, just like they had thought Emmett Whitfield was crazy 45 years before. But Doug had stood in 108 degrees of Missouri heat and watched his corn turn to dust, and he had felt the cool breeze rising off Clara's pond, and he had known, in a way that no spreadsheet could measure, that the old wisdom was the true wisdom. So he dug his pond, not with a shovel like Emmett, but with the same stubbornness, the same belief that water was the heart of everything. Clara helped him choose the site, using the hydrology skills she had learned in college and the intuition she had inherited from her grandfather. She showed him how to shape the edges for wildlife access, how to plant the buffer zone, how to select native species that would thrive in the local soil and climate. She introduced him to the NRCS agent who had helped her expand her own pond, and together they designed a system that would work with the land instead of against it. By the summer of 2020, Doug had a half-acre pond, small but functional, fed by a spring that Clara had helped him locate using dowsing rods and soil core samples and the kind of knowledge that doesn't come from textbooks. He had planted willows around the edges and native grasses in the buffer zone. He had reduced his corn acreage by 20% and replaced it with sorghum and cowpeas and sunflowers. The same crops that Clara had shown him could survive the heat. The other farmers thought he was crazy. They called it Doug's Folly, just like they had called it Emmett's Folly, and they laughed at him at the coffee shop and the grain elevator and the church potluck. But Doug just smiled and went back to tending his pond, because he had learned what Clara had learned, what Emmett had known without naming it. The heat wave of 2020 was mild compared to 2019, but the drought of 2021 was worse. The aquifer, already depleted by years of overpumping, dropped to levels that hadn't been seen since the Dust Bowl. Wells that had produced water for generations went dry. Irrigation systems that had run day and night in 2019 couldn't find enough water to run at all, and in the middle of it all, Clara's pond kept flowing. The spring that fed it, recharged by years of careful management, by the buffer zone and the deep roots and the refusal to pump the aquifer dry, kept producing water when every other source had failed. The microclimate around the pond kept her crops 10 degrees cooler than the surrounding fields. The native grasses kept the soil in place when the wind blew and the rain refused to fall. Doug's pond did the same for his farm, his half-acre of water, his stand of willows, his buffer of native grasses. They all worked together to create a pocket of resilience in a landscape that was becoming increasingly hostile to the kind of farming that had dominated Mercer County for a century. By 2022, there were 6 new ponds in Mercer County, all dug by farmers who had watched their crops die in 2019 and had finally understood what Emmett Whitfield had known in 1974. By 2023, there were 15. By 2024, the county had become a model for climate-resilient agriculture, featured in documentaries and textbooks and government reports. Clara still gives tours, still speaks at conferences, still dips her hand in the cool water of her pond every morning. But her favorite moments are the quiet ones, the mornings when the mist rises off the water and the herons fish in the shallows and the world feels the way it is supposed to feel. Not efficient, not optimized, alive. She thinks about her grandfather sometimes, about the 3 summers he spent digging in the clay, about the laughter he endured, about the faith he kept. She thinks about the heat wave that proved him right, about the farmers who finally understood, about the legacy that continues to grow, and she knows that the pond was never just water. It was wisdom, it was resilience, it was the future. built by a stubborn old man with a shovel, saved by a stubborn young woman with a degree, and passed on to anyone willing to listen. The water that refused to be wasted, the wisdom that refused to be forgotten, and the heat wave that finally made people understand why the pond was never wasteful. The pond was everything.